my English teacher friends. Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And I got a super duper good synthesis essay writing workshop for you. The essential question, the Simpsons predicted that, or did they? So for those not in the know and don't, get imbued in all the urban myths and legends, at current rate, the Simpsons accordingly have predicted 38 future events a la Nostradamus style. And I know my kids really get talking about this kind of stuff a lot. And if you're anything like me, engagement is lagging this time of year. So I got to do some circus tricks with my kids to keep them engaged. So this one's right in the sweet spot of their interest, right in their wheelhouse. In fact, one of my more reluctant learners said, Mr. Kuhn, that was fat. So I guess that means that was a pretty cool unit. So whether it be conspiracy theory, fraud, the government elite, the deep state, who knows? That's what we're going to grapple with in this one. And in 2 decades plus of teaching, I can honestly say that this was probably the best, most engaged Socratic seminar I've ever hosted. Before I dive in, please subscribe to the channel. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Spread the word far and wide to friends, colleagues, and students. Let's have this grow. In terms of sources and slides, I want to preface this. And in terms of my writing my exemplars, as I Bob Ross this whole thing for you, you're going to see in just a second a number of intros that I wrote. They're mine. I wrote them. There are 4 just to model and demystify how to do it. So there are 2 that use the declarative thesis heuristic and 2 that use the inverted thesis heuristic. And I take both sides of the fence, both sides of the arguments to be fair and balanced. So the sources that I needed to write and substantiate my claims and prove my argument, students found to be a little bit too confining, and believe it or not, they got a gazillion bends and slants on this argument. So truth be told, most of my students went and did their own research, which was pretty cool. So I don't know if my sources are going to benefit your kids. I opened up Pandora's box and just said, hey, have a field day, go get what you want. But the slides that you're going to see in just a second are down below in the video description as well. So if you want to host a writing workshop in the same vein as how I run things in terms of modeling and overkilling it with exemplars, by all means click down below and you have access to the slides. So I wrote a prompt, and it's very closely akin to what you see on the AP Lang exam for FRQ1, but you don't have to run this as a AP assignment. I think it works for on levels as well. It's a little advanced. I did it with my 11 region students. I'm in New York State, so on level juniors. I don't know if it would work for 9 and 10. It's kind of conceptually difficult to unpack this stuff, and it might even work for a media literacy unit as well if you're going that route. So let me read the prompt and then we'll unpack it together. The Simpsons has been good for a laugh or two since the show premiered on television in 1989. But are the citizens of Springfield also capable of predicting the future? The answer is, that's for you to figure out. During its 35-season and counting run, numerous episodes have been put forward as evidence that the show has an uncanny knack for foretelling future events. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops your position on the speculation or validity of the animation's accuracy to predict the future. So, pretty common fare there. And then in terms of talking about sources, kids that did their own research, I just stipulated that they have 6. A lot of them used YouTube videos, wide array of things. I mean, some of them got into Joe Rogan and Alex Jones. Very cool. And in terms of my own politics, I stayed out of it. It's not my job to indoctrinate kids and influence their theses and their slants on things. So as always, I Bob Ross this for you. I get to the proverbial easel and canvas and paint a slew of introductions, bodies, and even conclusions. And just like Bob Ross, I'm going to use heuristics. He used something called the wet on wet technique every time he tackled a natural landscape and modeled for students how to do it. And in terms of the introductory paragraph, I use something called the declarative thesis and the inverted thesis. So let's start with the declarative. When you declare the thesis in the first sentence. So you begin with the thesis. You got to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. And just to set parameters for this, my students are going to do a 4-paragraph essay, intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So what I'm going to show them in the introductory paragraph is this. I like it when students give the reader a GPS. I often use the following language for this. Drop the seeds for the line of reasoning, like show your reader where you're going in your body paragraphs. So that's what I mean by context and background, and I'll explicitly unpack that in just a second. And then it is an academic paper, so I do want to see some tier 2 level vocabulary. I just mean average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. Sentence constructs, many of you are familiar with my work and you know that I actively teach voice rhythm and flow. And we explicitly unpack rule number 18 by Strunk and White, in which they espouse the idea that there's 12 sentence types that can be patterned 20 different ways. So at this stage of the academic year, we're approaching May. My students are syntactical ninjas at this level. So if they give me attention and an iota of effort, and then the kicker. All introductory paragraphs are going to be 4 sentences long. That's typically what you do in a declarative. We can flip that over on its head and do something called the inverted thesis heuristic. And in this case, the 4th sentence is going to be the thesis. So students can begin with the seeds of the line of reasoning. They can begin with an analogy, a hook, something of that nature, the context background, and then the rest just stays static. Tier 2 level vocab, sentence constructs, 4 sentences. So enough about me bloviating about this in the ether. Let's unpack this and take a look at a couple of examples. So number 1, exemplar number 1, I'll just read it and then we'll, kind of parcel it out together. So many individuals in our country are self-appointed political pundits just because they have a social media account. And therein lies the problem. It is so easy to spread misinformation as well as be victimized by the endless barrage of fake news. In knowing that this dynamic is what informs several and individual sense of truth, the fact of the matter is that a large segment of society is easily duped by flimsy conspiracy theories. The Simpsons and their alleged ability to predict the future is just one more bogus news story. So let's go hunting for the thesis statement. You can see it comes in the last sentence, so this is inverted. Let's talk about sentence constructs. So one of the things I model for my students and really hammer early in the academic year, and I run something called a nuance academy where kids have to graduate and get diplomas and certificates, is how to wield all the syntactical units of dashes, semicolons, colons, put the commas correctly. Really, really, really want my students to be disciplined on that because you can really jazz up a sentence just with a simple dash. And what I have my students do is this simple rule: don't parallel your syntax. So you got to pay attention to the sentence you just dropped and don't parallel it. Otherwise, it's going to create a da-dot, da-dot, da-dot kind of tone. And struggling and emerging writers, at least in my experience, tend to over-rely on independent clauses and short, simple sentences, and that's what creates that monotonous, droning tone. So to model that concept for the kids, I have my sentence constructs laid down like that. In terms of tier 2 level vocabulary, it's up there, but I'm in my wheelhouse. I don't espouse that idea that if I use $1 million words that somehow I'm doing great writing. I like to disabuse kids of that notion. But you also can see where I'm going in my body paragraph. So those first three sentences kind of hint or like foretell or preview where I'm going in the two body paragraphs. And that's what I mean by the seeds of the line of reasoning. So that's like a perfect execution of an inverted thesis. Let's paint another one and see what we got cooking. So here's number 2. The media has most Americans believing that there are two distinct factions in our country: the conspiracy theorists, conservative Republicans, and the clear thinking enlightened masses, woke liberals. But within this dynamic lies the incontestable truth that the quirky hoax believers are typically on the right side of history. And as odd as it may sound, a mere animation has a scorecard that reads 38-0 in favor of the alleged lunatics. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Simpsons have a Nostradamus-like ability to predict future events, all because they have access to the inner workings of our corrupt government. So yet again, let's go spy the thesis. It comes fourth sentence. And this is one of the beauties of doing assignments and modeling. I found it easier for this particular prompt to invert. I actually struggled to model a declarative. I have one coming up, but it was actually it just seemed very naughty and convoluted to proceed that way. But I know some students' brains work in that manner. So you can see here some advanced sentence constructs, vocabs up. You can see the lines of reasoning, right? So I'm going to basically take a conservative Republican slant in one paragraph, take a look at woke liberals in the next paragraph, and I could even have space in there to offer my concessions and rebuttals. And I do want to say this because I know some of you might be looking at this intro saying, this guy's a whack job. I'm not telling the kids my political perspective. I'm just modeling, right? I really think it's dangerous when teachers indoctrinate and, really espouse and cling to their political beliefs and, spout them as truth. I'm going to be fair and balanced and show both sides of the argument here. And the goal for me always at the end of the year is I tell my kids, if you know my political persuasion at the end of the year, then I probably was a little too biased at some point in time during my instruction. I think I do a good job of presenting both sides of the faction when I model and when we do Socratic seminars and stuff. It's very important for me to be objective and neutral in my presentation of this. So students, yes, you can do this. It ain't so difficult. It's just a heuristic. So let's keep it simple. Let's take a look at number 3. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Simpsons have foretold future events on numerous occasions. So that, my friends, is a declarative thesis. So you can begin with the thesis, right? You're answering the essential question in that first sentence. Now let's lie the seeds for our line of reasoning, set the GPS, and get into kind of showing our hand to our reader. While some chalk this up to coincidence and the inner workings of crazed conspiracy theorists, the truth of the matter is that the animated series is exposing the deep state. So that's got to be one paragraph. I got to prove that later on. As unbelievable as it may sound, our current governmental systems are not working for the betterment of the American people. Instead, there are systems in place to bring about the demise of democracy. So again, I got to prove that in the bodies. From predicting stolen elections to the satanic elements in Hollywood and Disney, the Simpsons have been uncanny in their abilities to predict the inner schemes of our governments. So I know that some of my students do better in the introductory paragraph when they really explicitly front load. So I wanted to model that in a declarative. So you know that I got to talk about, the element of Hollywood and the element of Disney in this, and then really kind of unpack the conspiracy theorists and prove how they are in fact correct. So that's all the direction that I'm going in my paper. And in terms of next steps after this is done, I have my students cherry pick their quotes and paraphrases, and they can kind of do their organization right there in their annotations in the source packet, which in terms of doing FRQ1 on the AP Lang is really efficient, especially considering that, they have 3 essays to write under grueling circumstances come exam day. So this one is a tricky essay. I usually only model 3 times, but let's paint it one more. And again, I want to be fair and balanced and show, both sides of the fence equally for my students. The debate boils down to one simple fact. Far too many people in our country are extremely gullible and swayed by fake news stories. Upon close examination, it is quite clear that the evidence to support these alleged predictions is fraudulent in every way possible. It's not a new phenomenon. Folks have been doctoring hard science to prove everything from alien invasions to the inevitability of a forthcoming rapture. In no way whatsoever do the producers of The Simpsons have a quasi Nostradamus figure writing their scripts while making pinpoint future predictions with uncanny accuracy. So we inverted here again, but in those first 3 sentences, look at how I set the GPS. Now it kind of predicates the fact that my body paragraphs need to trespass into those territories, right? So this is a very easy way to establish the line of reasoning. And we're going to talk about body paragraphs in a second. And I'm going to show you an Aristotelian heuristic called the syllogistic method. Aristotle, in terms of how he taught argument at the Lyceum, would call this like setting the stage for cogency. Like, how do you create bulletproof arguments? And that's all we're really teaching kids is the following. Good thinking equals good writing, right? So all the thinking, all the organization needs to happen up top in those first 4 sentences of the introductory paragraph. So in all of these, you can see I'm cooking up some sentence constructs. My vocab is up, sounds academic. And it's that simple, 4 sentences. Thesis first or thesis last. Drop the seeds for the line of reasoning. Have some variety at sentence level to achieve voice rhythm flow. Keep the vocab up, but keep it in your wheelhouse. Sound natural, don't sound contrived, don't sound pretentious. Be you. So students, if you're following along, give it a whirl. Try your hand in an introduction. Next question becomes, so how do I write the body paragraphs, right? Because we got 4 paragraphs for this essay. And I've already alluded to this. We's are going to do the syllogistic method. Let me give you a little background on this. So it comes from Aristotle. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And students, when you get to college, you might encounter a book called Plato's Republic, especially if you take like an introduction to philosophy course or a linguistic course. And they tussled with their own essential question in that book. And the question is, what is justice? So all these great philosophical scholars and think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. Aristotle's no different than your composition teachers. He noted that some kids were stellar at creating and sustaining arguments and fleshing them out with support and analysis, and others were meh, and some just kind of tank bombed it. So he studied the inner machinations of the kids who could really orate well, and he had a eureka moment and said, aha, these kids are super mathematical and kind of computative in their execution of the argument. So he concocted his own heuristic called the syllogistic method. And literally it's math. It's logical math formula when you proceed from premise 1, premise 2 to conclusion. Here's an example. If I say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you always say, yup, Kristian, you are 100% correct. But if I follow it up with premise 2 and say, my dog ate arsenic, right? So I give you a little context, a little background, and I'm like, yeah, I got rats in my house, and they kind of congregate beneath the kitchen sink, so I put a whole bunch of arsenic underneath the kitchen sink. But this morning, I go out to get a cup of coffee, and there's little Skipper, my dog, beneath the kitchen sink, and I call him, and he's got white stuff all over his muzzle and grizzle. You naturally, deductively are going to conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for Skipper. Your dog's going to die. You've created a mathematical, computative, logical, bulletproof argument when you do that. So how do we morph Aristotle's heuristic and turn it into something that helps us wield a synthesis essay? It's easy. There's some math, so take some notes on this. The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. And I'll demonstrate this a couple of times because that could be a little tricky and abstract for kids. So, up top in the thesis, in the introductory paragraph, we just drop the thesis. The first premise is the space in which we state why we are espousing our beliefs. And in terms of the math, I like my students to take 3 sentences to anchor that argument. Here's the reason why. So, old school FRQ1 synthesis on AP Lang used to say ad nauseum, your argument must be central. And I think it's good policy, good practice. So your argument needs to be central. If you begin to quote and or paraphrase up in sentences 1, 2, and 3, I feel the student loses the centrality of the argument, and they also default on, fulfilling the demands of the assignment. They cease to be arguing and they're summarizing. We don't want to do that. We want to argue from top to bottom. So 3 sentences is kind of a safeguard to make sure that the argument is the focal point of the body paragraph. So 3 sentences, argue the why reason. Fourth sentence begins the second premise. And this is where we want to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing, right? So whatever why reason we drop in the first premise, our quotes and paraphrases need to align with that. And I'll model how to do that in just a sec. And then the kicker is this: body paragraphs need to be concluded. And this is where we're going to link echo all the way back to the prompt, all the way back to the thesis, because syllogisms often work like circles. So let's ask ourselves this question. So, how do I write a first premise? I got you covered. So some kids really struggle with this. So I do some stems. Usually I stay away from stems because I don't want to like fabricate kids' verbiage on their paper, and I don't want to be, the engine behind their ideas and their thinking. But just a couple of simple stems, and you could do this. There's a clear reason as to why. So I find when students say reason why, they by default drop the reason why. It's just kind of a natural progression. Or if they have a couple of reasons, you could say there are a couple of reasons why. So let me do the whole 3 sentences for you with that stem. There's one principal reason to prove that this is a mute discussion. Every alleged prediction is housed in a doctored or altered video. As such, the Simpsons footage that foretold the explosion in Beirut, even the fire in Hawaii, was all manufactured after the events took place. The only conspiracy at play is that far too many citizens are easily duped by fraudulent news stories. So during writing workshops, when I'm working with students, I often say this after we read the first premise, the first 3 sentences. What's the promise of your first premise? And basically, in this one, we're going to take a look at 2 things, right? We're going to take a look at the fires in Hawaii and the explosion in Beirut. And in terms that those Simpsons videos, apparently, there's research that they were doctored by AI after the events took place. So the Simpsons didn't even air those like years or months before the events took place. It's all fabricated. It's lies, right? So now I have to go get quotes and paraphrases in order to substantiate that and really hammer and flesh out that argument. So easy peasy, right? So quick reminder, first premise, 3 sentences argue the why reason. So let us take the stem away and look at a first premise that just is on its own, right? It's going to articulate the why reason, but be more implicit than the stem. And then I'll walk you through the whole syllogism with this first premise. As implausible as it is to believe, our government is operating from a pre-written script that the elites are orchestrating. And for some unknown reasons, the producers of the show have access to this information. While a total of 38 events have been foretold in countless episodes, The most telling are the Hawaii fires and Beirut explosion. So you can see I'm just flipping the narrative script here. I'm going to the other side of the fence, but I'm going to use the same textual support. This was awesome for my kids to see that you really can bend and like kind of like bastardize the language of quotes and the source material to flex it to support your argument. So this was really cool for my kids to see how you can use sources like often I told them this, like in arguments often they will use the words of their opponent against them, and that's one of the things I'm doing with this. At an AP level, I think in terms of shooting for complexity, this is a must. I really show my AP students how to do this at will. So in terms of the promise of the first premise, it's pretty clear. So let's go quote hunting. I got to go get my quotes and my paraphrases for this. So in doing this, I'm just getting all my support and analysis for the second premise. So fourth sentence, I usually either paraphrase or I quote. I get into my sources. So let's take a look at this. In an episode that aired 18 months before the tragic Maui fires, the Simpsons show prominent social elites such as Oprah Winfrey and George Soros setting blaze to massive swaths of residential areas. Source C. So if you get into my packet, you'll see Source C is actually a YouTube video. So I'm showing my kids like it's hard to quote videos, so just paraphrase it, right? But you got to tag the citation onto it and give credit. Not only did this scene later play out in real time, but the pivotal figures that pulled the strings of the deep state, conspicuously enough, stood the most to gain from the fires. Source A. So I really like this when you can get like source C and source A talking to each other. Again, that's an element of complexity that needs to be modeled and taught. So get A and C talking to each other, get them in sync, get them in unison with each other. And all this is a 1-2-3 punch. Quote, paraphrase, analysis. Wield it. Quote, paraphrase, analysis. Let me talk about how I get my quotes to be conversational, because like embedding is a skill that some students struggle with. I use something called the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum, so not exactly, a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps it relatively small, it should sound conversational. No, I'm using brackets. I think later on I'll be using some ellipses. That stuff needs to be taught as well for kids to be able to execute it. So I quoted, now I got to analyze it. With some critical distance behind us, it is abundantly clear that the elite benefited ginormously, so I got to go on to the next slide here, by this land grab, given that the likes of Mark Zuckerberg, Oprah, Obama, and Bill Gates all at present have multi-million-dollar compounds currently under construction. Source D. So you can see my line of reasoning is staying perfectly intact, right? In the promise of my first premise, I promised you a discussion of Maui. I still got to get to Beirut, right? Because those are the two things that I promised you. And the same is true of the Beirut explosion, right? So simple transition out of the D. As Stephen Nix points out, the social elite orchestrated this event in order to destabilize the Middle East prior to the onset of the current Israeli operations in Gaza, source B. And in likewise fashion, The Simpsons predicted this event almost 2 years in advance. Boom. So I got enough support and analysis there, right? And usually syllogistic body paragraphs take like 10, 12 sentences. So I got to wrap this up. Note in the conclusion here, it just takes 2, sometimes 3 sentences. Bring it full circle, right? While some chalk this up to mere coincidence, 38 occurrences nullify the claim. Clearly, our government is up to something, and the Simpsons have their finger on the pulse. That's a perfect line of reason, right? That stayed cogent from top to bottom. So it's really key, just to recap this, that you keep the argument central. So take 3 sentences, articulate the why reason, go cherry pick the quotes and paraphrases to keep the promise of the first premise, and make sure you bring it full circle and link it back to the thesis and the prompt. So paragraph 1, the introductory paragraph, is done. Paragraph 2, the first body's done. What do you do next? It's easy. You bust out another syllogism. So this heuristic of the syllogistic method, legitimately my students, all right, because I teach Lang and Lit and I do on level, they use it across the expository mode. So we're talking not just synthesis, but they use it for their arguments, they use it for their rhetorical analysis, Lit analysis, even research. They uniformly use it across the expository modes. So when we get into the second body paragraph, they just bust out another syllogism, shift focus. And we know that oftentimes it's a really good idea to offer rebuttals and concessions. My students usually do it in this body paragraph. So let me show you a couple of first premises in which students could reload the syllogism and take it in a different direction. So this first sentence right here, these first couple of sentences, just show how my students get into the concession. And oftentimes my struggling and emerging students just kind of steal the verbiage of my stem here to make sure that they set up that concession and rebuttal correctly. So just a transition but there's also a differing perspective on the issue that must be acknowledged and addressed. So kind of that nod of the hat. One can easily concede to the fact that, and boom, just go ahead. So take 3 sentences for that, right? And then in the rest of the syllogism, cherry pick the quotes, paraphrases, 10, 12 sentences, wrap it up. So here's a full one to show the opposing viewpoint. It's full 3 sentences. In an era in which AI is so pervasive and sophisticated, it has become increasingly easier to get people into buying conspiracy theories. Not only are internet and social media trolls doctoring video to prove that the Simpsons are soothsayers, but they can do so quite convincingly. But the bottom line is this: each prediction has been squarely debunked. So what do? Right? What's the promise of the first promise? Go get a couple of those conspiracy theories, those videos, and just unpack it. Prove my claim that all of these things have been debunked, right? It's urban legend, it's urban myth, it's haka-hooey, it means nothing, right? So 10 to 12 sentences, tag a conclusion on the end of that paragraph, right? Easy peasy. So keep the promise of the first premise all the way through, right? Just like the first model. So we got intro, 2 bodies done. We got to wrap the essay up. Early in the academic year, I do give my students these stems. I find students, they struggle with conclusions and oftentimes they don't even see the point of them. And I liken it to the following analogy. Conclusion paragraphs and essays are like the grand finale of a fireworks display. So you're like screaming universal truth, universal theme, exigence, moral of the story, right? And it's an all-encapsulating paragraph. So you might say something like, simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day. So you can see those are encapsulating statements that go to the big ideas again. And it just takes like 3 or 4 sentences to wrap this all up. I got an example right here just to model it. In no other words, the notion that the Simpsons have predicted countless events beforehand is the byproduct of urban legend. Not only have the theories been debunked uniformly, but there is zero credibility to any of the claims. The moral of the story boils down to a simple, albeit sad, truth. Far too many people in this country are easily swayed due to their collective ignorance. And boom, we're done. Now, that's the whole essay, my friends. So happy teaching, happy writing. Reach out to me if you have any questions or just want to drop me a line. My email is teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. No, I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. I do some work with NCTE, College Board Applied Practice Perfection Learning. So I'm very busy throughout the calendar year. And I offer some PDs and a ton of free webinars. So if you want to stay abreast of my comings and goings, you can go to my webpage, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. Also note that in the coming months, I'm going to offer a few courses, and one is called Teach It Right One-to-One Mentorship. So many of you know with the National Writing Project, I ran the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind. typically have like 15, 20 teachers in there. And we'd go over my heuristics across the expository modes, my word study academy, my nuance academy, and then my alternative grading methods. And the predominant feedback was, Kristian, I wish I could work with you one-on-one, or I wish you could work with like me and a couple of colleagues from the department so that we could get aligned. So that's what I'm going to do. If you want to work one-on-one, happy to do so. Or if you want me to work with your department, we absolutely can do that. I also have a self-paced course on that web page and an opportunity to work one-on-one or with the department just to go over my alternative grading methods, because I know that some of you absolutely want to reclaim your evenings and weekends, and you're kind of fascinated by those alternative grading methods. They're pretty cool, right? They free you up, and you can ditch an old paradigm that really doesn't work that well. So that's it. Be well, and good luck with this one.